Well, we're still looking at image design and the components of form and shape and how they contribute to both the narrative and the aesthetics of an image. And we're going to look this week at how layering an image adds extra interest to an image. And this image here, I went to photograph the sunrise, and as we've spoken about before, is that a sunrise isn't a photograph, it's a background. And so by layering an image, you can have the subject, which was my sunrise, in the background, and it's absolutely stunningly beautiful. But if I just photographed that and plain reflective water, it would have just been one of those images that people show you on the phone that just looks like a sunrise. You've seen a lot. So in order to put it in context and make it much more visually interesting, we try and layer the image. And so think about subject, and then once we've got that in mind, think about what can we add to that image to make it a lot more interesting for the viewer. And so that's what we're going to explore this week. So we're going to, when I'm talking about layers, we're talking about having a foreground, midground, and background to an image. And what that does is allows a viewer to enter into the image visually and take each layer as it presents itself to them. So they can walk around the image. So they typically walk in and see the foreground, then the midground, the background, and then they walk back around again to work out how does all this work with the narrative. And it makes your image a lot more, gives it a lot more depth, a lot more dimension, a lot more complexity, and a lot more visual interest by doing that. And when we talked about what makes an engaging image, the word engaging is what makes a viewer stay in an image and not just flick through it like they would pages in a magazine, where they look at the image but don't actually walk into it. So layers are one of the great visual tools that you as the photographer makes happen. So when we pick up our camera and we have a reason for shooting, because you don't pick your camera up and put it up to your face until something's triggered you to think, I'd love to photograph that, like seeing a sunset. That once you've decided what your subject is, which is like a sunset, you then need to think about how do I layer this image to actually make it much more complex, much more interesting, much more engaging for the viewer. And when I talk about complexity, I'm talking about complexity of narrative rather than visual complexity, because as we've spoken about before, the simpler we can make an image from a confusing perspective for the viewer, the better the image. But we're talking about complexity in terms of the narrative and the aesthetics of engaging the viewer. And also when we're talking about layers, we can layer an image using its content, and we're going to have a look at how we layer an image using its content and the actual objects within the image. And we can also cognitively layer images using colours and tones and textures. So if we have a look at where would we use this, I first only heard about the concept of layering images when someone was telling me about how to take landscapes. And they said, you know, a landscape shouldn't be flat. A landscape should allow the viewer to walk into it. And so you need to ensure that there is an interesting foreground element, an interesting midground element, and an interesting background element. And choose your depth of field accordingly of where you, what's in focus and what's out of focus. And also, if you want someone to identify with one of those particular layers, make sure that that layer is in focus. So I was introduced to the concept via landscape photography. But it was only later that someone said, well, that all of that is relevant to all types of photography. And when you look at all types of photography, using layers really strengthens the design of the images. So we're just going to have a look at the different genres of photography, and there's lots of genres of photography, and just see how layering helps each one of those. So within landscapes, I mean, these are, yes, they're both landscapes. They've sort of got a broad view associated with them. But you can see with both of these, there is a foreground, a midground, and a background. And in both of these, I've actually put the subject in the midground. We don't necessarily need to put subjects in the foreground. But what the foreground and background do is provide context for the subject. And anything that is in the image as background or foreground or midground needs to be there for a reason. The photographer needs to have specifically chosen the background and the foreground and the midground to cohesively control the narrative and the story. There shouldn't be anything in either of those layers or any one of those layers that takes away from the story, that is confusing for the viewer. But supportive information makes the information or the image so much stronger. So even with portraits, Spiros on the right here was a bazooka player at a wedding that I did. And I wanted the elements of the Greek restaurant to be within the image as the background to put him in context. And so the bazooka and him playing the bazooka is the foreground. Spiros himself is the midground, and the background is supporting the entire image. So all those three layers make the image stronger, and they all are part of the narrative. And not only being part of the narrative, from a colour and tone perspective, they're also very supportive. So the concept of being a Greek restaurant, the Greek colours are there in the background, even, you know, his shirt, etc. And in portraits, we can layer them. We particularly layer environmental portraits to add to the narrative of who it is we're taking. And in this one here, I've taken a photograph. I call this one Girl in a Mirror. And she's actually in the mirror, which is the midground, in focus, but she's physically in the foreground, which is slightly blurry, which takes our eye to the point that's in focus. And then the background is completely dark. And I've done that so that you stay within her and you don't go into the background. If I had lit the room behind her, then it would have been very confusing. So when you're controlling these layers, you need to think about, how is the viewer going to walk through this image? Where do we want them to look? And how are the different layers going to inform the viewer of what we're trying to communicate to them? Still life is a really important to use layers to walk the viewer through the image. And I've said to you before, not many people tackle still life photography because it's hard. And even when I did the series on the left, I called it Colours Through the Ages, and I did the whole of the 20th century for each decade and did the colours, the crockery, the jewellery that we wore, each one of them has a background of a scarf that was typical of that era, that showed a pattern and colours of that era. And what it really brought home to me is still life is all about composition, and it finely tunes your composition skills. So although you may not like still life and you may find it really hard to shoot, what it does is it really forces you to put in place all of these aspects that I've been teaching you about composition, about where to put your focal point, about layering your images, about textures, about shapes and lines, about leading lines. And so, you know, if you do nothing else, do think about just putting some kitchen items on the kitchen bench and photographing it, and you'll find it's certainly not easy. When I did this series, I showed it to a friend who was an artist, and she said to me, my God, you did still life. Still life's the hardest thing. She said portraits are really easy to paint. She said still life, the fact that you've actually got to make the image yourself is really, really hard. And yeah, it is really, really hard. So try that. And the other thing is food photography. Food photography is all about layering the images and working out what you want people to look at, but what else in the image is actually going to support the context, like an environmental portrait of that piece of cake. What is in the foreground that supports it and what's in the background that supports it, and where is the subject actually positioned? And the subject, people seem to think that often that the subject has to be in the foreground. It doesn't. It can be the background. It can be the midground and it can be the foreground. It's just ensuring that your focal points and your depth of field lead the viewer into understanding where the subject is. And also, remember we talked about the lightest part of the image or the darkest part of the image, giving people a clue about what you want the subject to be. Or if it's red or yellow, that also gives them a clue. Architectural photography, this is very much about layering images. And when I first started doing architectural photography, I asked an architectural photographer to mentor me. And one of the first things he said when he looked at the images that I'd taken is, Pam, don't forget you have to allow people to walk through an image. And so be very careful. Don't put a barrier in the front of them that I suppose you could say with the one on the left, it has a barrier, but that was about photographing the reception area of a particular showroom. But if you're showing them a room, always allow them to walk through the room. Don't put the back of a chair or the back of a couch right in front of the front of the photo. So make sure that you do have a foreground, a midground, and a background to encourage them to walk through the room and make the room three-dimensional. And that's what layers do, is add that depth and dimension to an image. Use it in street photography. Street photographers first choose their background, and it isn't the subject. The subject is always the people that are going to be walking through it. But if you've got the background composed correctly and the foreground, you've either decided to make it plain, or you may have, like in the case on the right there, I've put the steps in to provide context to it, and the background to provide context to it. So with every image, I always think about, why did I pick up the camera, and then choose the background. So even if you're trying to photograph someone walking down the street and you suddenly see them, so you haven't been there planning where the background is, in that split second, you have to work out how to position them so the background actually supports the narrative and doesn't take away from them in terms of distracting. Nature photography, the same thing. We need to think about what the subject is, but what's the foreground, what is a complementary background, and how do we layer the image to make it more interesting while still keeping it simplified. Night photography is like our sunsets and our sunrises, and the one on the right was when I was in Tasmania a couple of weeks ago, and we went to photograph the Aurora Australis. And yes, it's absolutely amazingly beautiful, but it isn't interesting enough in its own right, as neither is the Milky Way. We really need to put a subject in the front of it to give it, I guess there's a scale issue or a scale thing here. There's a context of where is this particular night sky. Well, it's at a lighthouse, and lighthouses are, right on the edge of the coast, and the Aurora Australis is always facing south. So that gives us an idea of the context of that particular image. So we talked about physically layering images using the subjects within the different layers. We can also layer cognitively using colour, so that we end up with stepping the viewer through the image, because the different subjects within the image are different colours, and it leads the viewer through the image using those layers. We can also use tone, which is the brightness and darkness of different sections within the image, and that also allows the viewer to step through. And in the one below here where we've got the swans there, that's what I wanted to photograph, but they were way out in the lake and pretty hard, even with a long lens, to get them. So I decided they would just be supporting parts of an image, or cookies within the image, as we often call them. And I would use the tonal shades of the reflections and the mist and the rain and the clouds to actually provide the textures within the image and make it look more interesting. Another one where we've used tone. So the tones and textures in the foreground are the interesting foreground part, but then we move up the image to see those silhouettes, because our eye always goes towards a human form. And this is, remember we talked about numbers? I specifically waited until I had the right number of people on steps. So it was a 3 or 5, sort of 2, 3, 5 number, which was our Fibonacci numbers. And then the sky is the background, and it was really useful having a very blank, muted sky, because if that sky had really strong contrasty clouds in it, it would have competed with the people. So each one of those layers actually supports the image. We can do a cognitive layering using textures and different textures within the different layers. And the last thing we can do is actually creatively use layers. And this is a really interesting concept. It's called figure ground confusion. And we often see it, graphic artists do it. And you must have seen those graphic arts where you're not sure you're looking at an old woman or a young woman, because you're not sure what the foreground is and what the background is. It's difficult to do in photography because it's hard to find in real life, this figure ground confusion of what's the background, what's the foreground, what's the midground, because your eye tricks you. So, but it does provide a really intriguing image. So if you ever see that figure ground confusion in real life, photograph it, because it does provide an interesting image. I also did one once where I photographed a pelican flying, and it was flying, but it was stretched out. But there was a wall behind it where it looked like it was stretched out on the wall, but it was actually flying through the air. So you sort of look at it and go, what an odd position for a pelican to be. But it intrigues the viewer and keeps them in the image. So if you can try and introduce that figure ground confusion, that also makes your image more engaging. So what I want you to do this week is, again, increase your visual vocabulary by looking at images. When on the television, have a look in when you're seeing how cinematographers set up a scene. Have a look at how they layer the image to make the image more visually engaging. When you're reading magazines, when you're reading the newspaper, have a look at how the photographers have layered scenes. They're very careful about what they include in the foreground, midground and background to ensure that it actually supports the narrative of the image, but makes it a lot more interesting, visually interesting from a viewer's perspective, and also gives it depth and dimension. Next week, when we're photographing at Alwyn Gardens, I want you to have a look when you're framing up your image. How do you introduce those elements of foreground, midground and background to make it much more interesting? So a lot of times when I see people pick up a camera, that they think they're photographing something that's interesting. It is interesting in itself, but it will become just a snapshot. But by stepping back and thinking about framing it up to give it a background and give it a foreground and then make it the subject, it just makes that whole image a lot more interesting. So also think about, when you are framing out, all the other elements we've talked about of texture and leading lines and shapes and colours, of how do you add framing, the visual balance of your image. Don't make the foreground element too strong or big if it's not the subject of your image, because it put it out of balance. All of those things need to be thought about when you are framing up. So I look forward to seeing your photos next week, and thank you.